Okay, folks, let's go over some layout here for our hip roof. So as a reminder, let's go over the names of the parts of the hip roof. In blue here is the ridge, and then in red we have the commons and the jacks, and in green we have our hips. Now remember, the three commons that make up the intersection with the hips there to define the shape of the hip roof, those are called king commons. Now, this is the roof we're going to lay out. So we have a 7 and 12 roof, and that's our pitch. And then the span is just the overall width of the building. So in this example, our span is 4 feet, and the run is just half of the span. And this run is what we're going to base all of our calculations on. So in this example, our run is 2 feet. So I'm going to write that down. Then we need to know the height above plate of our common rafter, because we need to match this height above plate with our hip rafter. And so what I've already done is laid out the bird's mouth of a common rafter for a 7 and 12 roof. So I used some scrap, I laid out my bird's mouth, and then all I did was measure the height above plate. And so for this example, the height above plate is 1 3/4 inches. So we're going to write that down. And obviously this is different on every roof. If your rafters are wider, if your pitch is different, your HAP will be different. But for this example, our height above plate is 1 3/4 inches. And then the last calculation I did is we need to know how much of the head cut we're going to need to adjust for our hip rafter. And I'll show you how to do the calculations on the calculator a little bit later on in this video series. But I did the math, and we're going to have to shorten our hip rafters by 1 1/8 inches. So with this information, the pitch, the run, the height above plate, and the amount that we have to adjust our head plumb cut, we can go ahead and lay out our hip rafter. The last bit of information for our layout is how much overhang there is. So I'm going to draw this in as a dotted line. And for this roof, we'll have a 6-inch overhang all the way around. So we'll need to know what our overhang is. Now this is on the level. We'll have to calculate the overhang both for the commons and also for the hips, but we have the information now to complete our hip rafter layout. So the first thing we're going to lay out, or calculate if you will, let me draw this in. We've got our hips and our ridge. So our hip rafter goes from this theoretical center point out to the corner of the building, and then the overhang continues on out. So the first thing we'll calculate is the length of the theoretical rafter from the center point to the outside of the building. Then we'll calculate the length for the overhang, and then we'll come back and calculate how much we need to shorten the hip rafter for reality. So the first entry in our Construction Master Pro calculator is going to be from the ridge to the outside corner of the building, the theoretical length. So we type in our 2-foot run, 2 feet run, our 7-inch pitch, 7-inch pitch, and now we hit the hip and valley button, and we see that this length is 3 feet and 11/16 of an inch. I'm going to write that down. Then for our overhang, which is an additional 6 inches of run, we'll do our second calculation where we have 6-inch run, 7-inch pitch, hip valley, And so we'll know we'll have to add 9 3/16 of an inch to get the total length of our theoretical rafter. Then the final thing we need to calculate here is how much we need to adjust that head plumb cut for reality. And in this example, our ridge is inch and a half. So we need to take half of that as the run. So we'll go 3/4 of an inch, run, same pitch, 7-inch pitch, and we hit hip valley, and I'll convert that from decimal inches to fractional inches just by hitting the inch button again, and we get inch and an eighth. So we know we have to add our 3 feet and 11/16 plus 9 3/16 to get the overall length of the rafter. And then we need to shorten that rafter by 1 inch and an eighth for the head plumb cut. So to start the layout, we're going to pull our length. So I'm going to hook my tape over the end of the rafter, crown up, and I'll make a mark at 3 11/16, and then I'll make another mark at the very end at 9 3/16. And then what I've done is I've taken my square and squared my line. Then we're going to use the hip valley scale. So now's the time to take the tape off. Hip valley, cover the commons, and we'll use our same pivot point, and we'll pivot to the 7, and we'll drop our plumb lines. So I'm going to rotate this. On our hip, we do all of our measuring along the spine here. And what I also did, which is going to come in handy in just a little bit, is at each one of these lines, I marked the center point. So I'm using my combination square. You could use a tape measure. And a quick way to figure out if it's truly the center is if you flip the square around, the mark should be in the same location. So I put a center mark here and a center mark up here. The last adjustment I need is I need to pull back from the very end here inch and an eighth. Inch and 3/4 is the half. And I've made my line and found my center point. Then for our plumb cuts, using the hip valley scale, from that point, we just strike our 3, 7 and 17, if you will, plumb cuts. So we have the lengths across the top. We've got the plumb cuts along the face. Okay, so we've got our 3 points, the adjusted head, the back of the bird's mouth, and the end of the tail. And we dropped our 3 plumbs down the face. And we used the correct hip valley scale. And now what I want to lay out is the cheat cuts for the head. And so we're going to flip and do our layout along the spine here. And I'm going to use my speed square. And what we're going to do is this is going to be the point right in the middle. And we know it's 45 degrees in either direction, so we can use our speed square. And what I'm going to do is flip it over this way just so we have more square on the thing, on the rafter. I'm going to draw crisscross applesauce. I'll just flip this over. Lines right through that center point. And if we're looking at this from the top, all of this here is going to get cut away. Do you see that? So this becomes the tip of the rafter, and here's the angle for our cheek cut. And so I'll transfer that mark there a little bit and that mark there. What we're going to do is, I'll flip this down so we can see it a little bit better, is draw 2 more parallel plumb cuts. Right, same 7 and 17. And our rafter, when it's cut, will end up having this cut and this cut along here. And the reason we draw in this point right here is because that's the first cut with your circular saw. You'd set your circular saw at a 45-degree angle and cut along this line. Then you'd come around to the other side with that same 45-degree angle and you'd make your cut along this line. And you'll end up with the point here. We'll demonstrate that in a different video. So this middle line is really just to help us know where the end of the theoretical rafter is. It's this line here, this gets cut first, and this line here from the other direction gets cut second. And what you're left with is the double cheek cut of the hip rafter. The next thing we're going to lay out are the double cheek cuts for the tail. So I'll flip this up. And we marked our tail. We found the center point. And this is going to be the long point. And in this case, the cheek cuts are going to go uphill when this is rotated upright. So I'm going to do that same technique of drawing the two 45-degree angles. And on your speed square, you've got a 90-degree angle and then a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to draw along this part of the speed square and line it up the middle. And then all you need to do is flip it over. And that gets you the other 45. Put my pen right there on the middle. And just like the head cut, when we're done cutting, all of this material, obviously the rest of it, will be cut away. And that's going to be the long point of our tail. And then we need to do the same transfer of lines with the plumb cuts. Just transfer those marks there. Sometimes it's nice if you have an eased edge on your rafter to rip it or joint it straight so that you don't have that round over. And since I have my pen set up on my other square, I'll use that one. Just like we did at the head cut, we're going to draw 2 more plums. And these become the lines that we're going to cut with our circular saw. So the first cut we'll make is this one, where we'll drop the saw over at a 90-degree angle. Here's my hand is the blade. And we'll cut along this edge. And then when we come around to the other side, we'll follow along this edge, which will cut the second cheek. So these 2 lines are the lines we cut. This line is just representing the very long point of the cheek cut. Now, the final part of our layout is the bird's mouth. So we already have the back of the bird's mouth cut. We've got the plumb line drawn, but we need to do that same kind of layout. So remember, this is the longest point on the bird's mouth. This is the outside corner of the building. So our bird's mouth angles are going to go uphill just like the tail. So we'll use that same speed square technique where we just draw 2 45-degree angles. that crisscross right through the middle. And then I'll just either flip this over this way or flip this over this way. It doesn't matter. Just flip your square over and draw your lines. Now, this point here is the corner. And this point here is where the hip crosses the edge of the building. So, when we make our plumb cuts, in this case, I only need this forward plumb. Our bird's mouth needs to be cut to this line here because that's the outside corner. Right, that's the outside corner of the building. But our height above plate gets measured here where the edge of the hip crosses the edge of the building. And so this is where we measure our height above plate. And the height above plate from our common we measured earlier is 1 3/4 inches. So we'll measure down along this line, which is the 1 3/4 inches. Let's see, I'll line this up. Back here, I'm holding my square parallel with that back corner and then making sure that my bird's mouth line goes through that point. Okay. So the bird's mouth goes back here. This is the corner. But we measure our height above plate here at the edge of the building. And since it was 1 3/4 inches on our common, it's 1 3/4 inches for our hip. And so our bird's mouth cut now is all this area.